Good evening, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to Europe House. Dear guests, colleagues, friends, distinguished panelists, welcome to Europe House on behalf of the European Parliament Liaison Office in London, the Delegation of the European Union to the UK, and the Ukrainian Institute London on this very special and important discussion. My name is Susanne Oberhaus, and I'm the head of the Parliament Office here. So let me give you a very warm welcome also to our special guests and speakers on the panel, and of course to all of you who have come here in huge numbers. We are very impressed. It's wonderful to see such a full house and such a great interest in this topic. And I think it is a tribute really to the fact that we cannot see any signs of Ukraine fatigue or any of the sort. We have had the event booked out in record time, and there was waiting lists still there. So thanks to all of you for coming. So ever since Ukraine's illegal and full-scale invasion of Ukraine 2 years ago in February 22, the EU and the European Parliament have supported the country by condemning Russia's aggression, sanctioning those responsible, and providing financial and material aid. We have seen during these 2 years unprecedented levels of EU unity and determination, not only expressed through humanitarian, economic, military assistance, but also by providing Ukraine with a concrete and tangible pathway towards EU membership. I'm sure the ambassador will speak on that in a moment. The European Parliament has been vocal about supporting Ukraine's effort to become an EU candidate country and has been calling for the launch of accession talks. As an institution, we have been steadfast in our support for the Verkhovna Rada, the Ukrainian Parliament, offering a wide range of assistance and a far-reaching capacity-building program. Here in London, we have organized several events and an exhibition focusing on individuals' experience of Ukrainian refugees. And tonight is the 7th event that we are co-organizing with our partners from the Ukrainian Institute. Thank you very much, Olesya.
Thank you.
Now, allow me to close with a quote from our president, Roberta Metsola, who stated just some days ago in Strasbourg at the occasion of a plenary session. And she said, 2 years ago, we promised the people of Ukraine that we would stand with them for as long as it takes. That promise still stands. We are in this together for a future of peace, justice, and freedom. We will not waver. Slava Ukraini. Now, I would like to invite Eduard Fesko, the Chargé d'Affaires of Ukraine, to say a few words to us here. Before then, handing over the floor to Olesya Khromeychuk, the director of the Ukrainian Institute, who will be the moderator for this discussion tonight on the future of Ukraine. Thank you very much, all of you. Thank you.
Dear friends, Your Excellencies, thank you for such a warm welcome, and thank you Ukrainian Institute and the European Mission for putting this together. And I am honored to open this discussion with such a distinguished panel. Since I was given just 5 minutes, I'll try to be very brief. I'll make just 3 points for reflection for people in the audience and hopefully by the panel as well. First, the current state of play with supply of armaments to the battlefield and the situation on the battlefield. It is important because the fate of this war will be decided on the battlefield, not behind a theoretical negotiating table. In 2023, Russian manufacturers produced about 2 million artillery shells. 2 million. As of January this year, Russia's capacity is estimated at the level of production of 115, 130 strategic missiles and 100, 120 cruise missiles. numbers. The entire resource of the Russian armed forces is concentrated right now in Ukraine, amounting to over 400,000 personnel. They have a bigger army in Ukraine now than they had in 2022, despite the losses approaching 400,000. And we know that's one side of the story. Another side of the story, as we know, is about 1 million shells that have not materialized for different reasons. And we are happy to see that the European Union is moving towards that kind of production levels. But the Russian economy is already a military-style economy. Our allies are working towards that, but not there yet. Last year, in 2023, there were over 6,000 air alerts in Ukraine. Russia launched over 7,000 missiles. This year, from the beginning of this year, Ukraine has lived through one of the biggest aerial attacks in history after World War II. And the estimated cost of this aerial bombardment is about $2.5 billion US. Russia is throwing money at the war effort as if tomorrow does not exist. I think we have to be clear about that. The second point is, what are the implications for European security, for the world security? If Russia is allowed to prevail, Russia will have a military economy, will have a replenished stockpile. They are using up to 30% of their GDP on the military production, on the military complex. They have a battle-experienced and hardened army, which is not afraid of using force, which has no qualms about committing war crimes, and it will have a strengthened sense of impunity. And they will have economic problems inside the country. Where will they turn their attention to? Make your guess. Then, occasionally, we hear this phrase, war fatigue, in the West. This is one of the phrases that really gets my blood boiling. When people are using these two words, do they think that Ukrainians are not tired after 2 years of this brutal war? But somehow it is up to us, pesky Ukrainians, to spur others into action and to drive home the message that this war will not be over tomorrow. To finish it requires more resources, more efforts. The job that is half done is a failed job. We want peace more than anyone. We're working hard to get to that point. People know that our president has presented a peace formula, and we are working at the negotiating table with many partners. But we are realists that at this point, it takes more than just talk to get peace. Then, third point, final point, justice. Without justice, there can be no sustainable peace. That's why we call for establishment of a special tribunal for the crime of aggression against Ukraine. There can be no question that this discussion, that these decisions have to be made. It's not a straightforward decision, but it has to be taken. Closely linked to this issue, to the issue of fairness, justice, is the use of Russian frozen assets for Ukraine's reconstruction. We don't want Western taxpayers to foot the bill. There are money waiting to be used for that purpose. They're available. And we welcome the discussions that are being held by lawyers, politicians, diplomats. We see some positive light in that direction. So these 3 points, having thrown that onto those tables, I pass the floor to Olesya, and I'm sure that we will enjoy a wonderful discussion today. Thank you.
Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Before we begin our discussion, I'm so thrilled to see such a full house, but can I also encourage some of this highly determined audience to find the seats in the audience, because there are still some free chairs that I can see, so maybe my colleagues can point you to those chairs. So you can be a bit more comfortable seeing and hearing us as we begin our discussion. My name is Olesya Khromeychuk. I'm the director of the Ukrainian Institute London. We're an independent charity that champions Ukrainian culture and shapes conversation about Ukraine in the UK and beyond. And we're absolutely thrilled to be hosted once again by the European Parliament Liaison Office in the UK and organize this event in partnership with them, one of many fruitful partnerships that we've enjoyed over the past 2 years, and also co-organized by the European delegation to the UK. This February, we are marking 2 years since the start of the full-scale invasion, but also 10 years since the start of the war, which began with Russia's illegal occupation of Crimea. And so we'll take stock of those 10 years and 2 years, but we'll also look to the future. That is what we hope to achieve, both from the discussion on the panel, but also the discussion from the floor as well. We have an absolutely incredible panel of speakers today, so I'll be very brief in my introductions. We are joined today by the head of the delegation of the European Union to the United Kingdom, His Excellency Ambassador Pedro Serrano. He was head of cabinet of European Union's High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy and European Commission Vice President Josep Borrell until October 2022. And his previous roles include that of Deputy Secretary General for Common Security and Defense Policy and Crisis Response at the European External Action Service and Diplomatic Advisor to the President of the European Council. Our next speaker will be Dame Melinda Simmons, who was the ambassador to Ukraine, British ambassador to Ukraine until September 2023. She worked for the Department for International Development in several policy roles, including a tour overseas in South Africa, as well as heading up the Middle East and the Europe departments. She also worked for the National Security Secretariat at the Cabinet Office, setting up and running a cross-government fund focused on the prevention and resolution of violent conflict before transferring to the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. Before taking up the role in Kyiv, Dame Melinda was head of conflict department as part of her role there. She campaigned for justice for crimes of sexual violence against women and girls in war-torn countries. Next, I'd like to introduce Nataliya Gumenyuk, who is a Ukrainian journalist and author specializing in foreign affairs and conflict reporting. She is the CEO of the Public Interest Journalism Lab and co-founder and lead journalist of the Reckoning Project. I really hope we'll discuss it in more depth today, which documents war crimes in Ukraine. Nataliya is the author of several documentaries and books, including The Lost Island, Tales from the Occupied Crimea, and Maidan Tahrir. She regularly writes for The Guardian, The Washington Post, The Atlantic, and many other outlets, and has provided commentaries for CNN, Sky News, and others. She's the co-founder and head of independent Ukrainian media Hromadske TV and Hromadske International. And you were the head of it 5 years, is that right? Yes, and is currently a board member as well. Nataliya is a member of the Council for Freedom for Speech under the President of Ukraine, as well as the Independent Media Council. We're very privileged to also be joined by Christina Lam, OBE, who is Chief Foreign Correspondent at the Sunday Times and one of Britain's leading foreign journalists, as well as a best-selling author. She has reported from most of the world's hotspots, from Afghanistan to Ukraine, and has won numerous awards, including 6 times being named Foreign Correspondent of the Year. She has authored 10 books, including Our Bodies, Their Battlefields, What War Does to Women. She's a global envoy for UN Education Cannot Wait and honorary fellow of University College Oxford on the International Board of the Institute of War and Peace Reporting and associate of the Imperial War Museum. And last but certainly not least, I'm delighted to introduce Rory Finnin, who is Professor of Ukrainian Studies at the University of Cambridge and a man who's been popularizing the knowledge about Ukraine for decades, I would say, sometimes felt like single-handedly. He launched Cambridge Ukrainian Studies in 2008 and is former head of Department of Slavonic Studies at Cambridge and former chair of Cambridge Committee for Russian and East European Studies. Rory is also a trustee of the Ukrainian Institute London, so please join me in welcoming this exceptional panel of speakers. Ambassador, if you allow me, let me begin with you. 10 years ago, Ukrainians, just over 10 years ago, Ukrainians made their European choice very, very clear to themselves and the rest of the world with the revolution of dignity. And in fact, I think reminded a lot of Europe, especially Western Europe, what those values that are so frequently labeled European actually mean. That they mean standing up to authoritarianism and they mean protection of freedoms, freedoms of speech, and so on. 10 years later, in December 2023, the European Council opened negotiations on Ukraine's accession to the European Union. Earlier this month, EU member states agreed on another package in support of Ukraine. And Josep Borrell has just visited Kyiv and spoke in Ukrainian parliament. And I'd like to offer an extract from his speech. I'll just quote 3 points from the speech that he gave in the Ukrainian parliament. We need to change the complete institutional setting of the European Union to adapt it to this new geostrategic reality. It is no longer about making peace among us. It is to face the challenges in our borders. We need a paradigm shift from supporting Ukraine for as long as it takes to committing ourselves to support Ukraine for whatever it takes. Not for how long, but for whatever it takes. It is not a matter of duration. The shorter, the better. And in order to be shorter, it has to be tougher. Whatever it takes for Ukraine to achieve victory. And he ended his speech by saying, I do not see you succumbing to fatigue, and as far as you don't, we will not do it either. So I've got 2 questions to you. The first one is to comment on these pledges that are being made, not just to support for as long as it takes, but actually offer whatever it takes to achieve victory. And the second on this idea that the need to readjust European Union to the new geopolitical reality, and some would argue it's long overdue.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. Thank you so much, Olesya, and many thanks to Edward and to Suzanne for their introductions. Let me also, as head of this house, if you allow me, to welcome all of you here. It's quite a privilege to host this event, not the first event that we host on Ukraine. Quite a series of events that have been hosted in Ukraine, and not a coincidence that we are hosting events for Ukraine, and nor that the Ukrainian flag is flying outside our doors, as you might have seen. This is the Europe House, and it's the House of Ukraine, and we feel proud to fly Ukrainian flag in this building. It's part of the whatever it takes, and as long as it takes, because I think both are part of this. So. And I would like to start, it is the Europe House, and Ukraine, and supporting Ukraine is a European cause, but it's not only a European cause, it's a world and international cause. And I think it is clear that Russia has violated gravely international law, has violated the territorial integrity of the country, has violated the interdiction to use the force as a means for international action. And so it's in deep violation of its international commitments and UN commitments, which explains why it has been condemned, maybe not with the word condemned itself, but severely called and to stop this aggression in numerous General Assembly resolutions. Not in the Security Council for obvious reasons, because Russia blocks the Security Council. That's another story. But I did want to make the point that the war that Ukraine is waging, it's waging a war for all of us. And certainly for Europe, because we think that if this war is not won by Ukraine with our support, the risk of greater aggression from Russia to the European continent will increase and will become even worse, but also for the rest of the world. And I talked to many diplomats of other countries in the world that point out that they feel affected by this, that it is important to send a message to all those that may be tempted to use force as a means of engagement with other countries around the world. They have to learn that this is not the way forward. It does not succeed. Ukraine has to recover fully its territorial integrity, and that's what we stand for. Now, what does that mean in terms of the kind of support that we provide to Ukraine? The EU was very quick in reacting. Sometimes we're criticized, we're slow, bureaucratic, well, in this case, we were nor slow nor bureaucratic. Immediately after the invasion on the 24th of February, the European Union was quick to condemn in the strongest term and to start taking very immediate actions. Sanctions, because you were saying, how has this changed the geostrategic perspective? In reality, you realize that defense, I'm going to defer a bit with my friend Edward, who pointed that this was about military support. It is about military support, but not only military support. And the support to Ukraine has to be a much more global support, and it is being a very global support, because defense is much more than just military means. So sanctions were the first instrument deployed in order to try to block the funds of Russia that were in our banks, to block Russian companies that were doing business with that, to try to prevent Russia to receive equipment that would help its war effort, and to cut as much as we could the flows of economy going into Russia. And that is a very important part of the effort that we're carrying out. We've developed already 12 packages of sanctions. There are more than 2,000 persons and entities in the list of sanctions, and we continue developing that part. Another very important part is to continue supporting Ukraine financially. Ukraine has to continue to live and to have an economy that works. We have been supporting the efforts in the Black Sea to keep the Black Sea open. And by the way, we're saying that things have not changed and not advanced. They have advanced, and actually we have to take note of how Ukraine has opened the space for itself in the Black Sea, and I think that's a very important issue. But we've also worked to open other solidarity lanes, as we call it, to provide other ways of channeling goods outside, export goods outside of Ukraine. So that has been an important effort. Macro-financial assistance. We've just approved a package of 50 billion euros. All in all, we provided already more than close to 26 billion. All in all, we've provided up to now 88 billion in support to Ukraine in all, toutes catégories confondues, in all different areas. But macro-financial support is a very important part of the support that we're providing to Ukraine. Humanitarian support. We have 4 million Ukrainian citizens living in Europe. The European Union is contributing also to the financing of these persons that have had to flee Ukraine and then seek refuge. And the diplomatic support, of course, we full of admiration by the work done by Minister Kuleba and of course President Zelensky himself. I think nothing moves the international community more than the appeals and the trips also that President Zelensky, despite the difficulties, has been able to do abroad, and all the visits that have been received in Kiev as well. And the final point, before reaching the military one, I'll reach the military one and then go to the final, which is accession, which is more important from a geostrategic perspective, and military, of course. And the military has been a game changer for the European Union in many ways. I think that responds partly to your questions. It is true that we have realized now, European member states, the European Union has realized that we can no longer live in a world thinking that cooperation and openness will bring peace and security. We need to be able to defend ourselves. I think one of you was referring to strategic autonomy. You were, Edward. Referring to strategic autonomy. Well, the time has come, indeed, not to seek a strategic autonomy. That means that the European Union will be able to to provide for all its security needs, but it has to provide very serious defense capabilities in order to work with other partners and allies in bringing security to Europe and to the rest of the world as much as it can and has to. And therefore, we've moved into a period where we have started developing jointly defense capabilities. We have different instruments. Where we can, we have created instruments to be able to support militarily our partners. And we've supported now, we've given 28 billion so far in military support to Ukraine, with around 6 billion from a fund that is managed by the European Union. And we will continue, of course, this important support. We've increased, in 1 year, we've increased 40% already now the production of artillery shells to provide Ukraine. We are not reaching our ideal goal by March, but we will hope by the end of the year we will have provided Ukraine up to 1.2 million 155 millimeter shells, and we will continue upgrading our defense capability production. So there's been really a change of paradigm in terms of security in Europe, and we have realized that we have to ramp up our industrial capacity. We will be presenting in March, meaning the High Representative and Commissioner Breton, will be presenting a defense industry strategy that will sustain this effort, and not only for Ukraine, but for the EU itself as part, or as part of, let's say, the effort for security in Europe, that of course NATO and allies are a very important part, and this is done in full complementarity and coordination, by the way, with both NATO and key allies. So we are ramping up these efforts, and we know that this is not just for now, that we have to remain technologically and from an industrial perspective a powerful entity. It doesn't stop with military, as I was saying at the beginning. Very important also the security of our supply chains and all critical materials and industry. So this we knew already, because there are threats coming from other corners, not only from the Russia war, and therefore we are moving very much in this new direction to be able to defend ourselves better. And the last point, and I think our last contribution that will continue to support Ukraine, is through the accession process. I think you were saying the other day that I have a diplomatic plate that says EU 27.
Wasn't me.
Oh, well, I would say EU 37. It's not EU 27. The significant number now is EU 37. We have 9 candidate countries plus another that will no doubt become candidate. We have 10 countries aspiring to join the European Union, and Ukraine is certainly one of them that has been granted status in candidate status, in which negotiations hopefully will be starting very soon. And there's no doubt that belonging to the European Union is the vertebral column for security, for prosperity, for democracy in Europe. And this, again, has been one of the big changes and the geostrategic changes of the European Union of today. And it has been, no doubt, partly because of the situation in Ukraine and the war in Ukraine, that this major step has been taken. I think I've talked already too much, and but of course you are patient because you're in my house, which is our house and your house as well, and certainly Ukrainians' house. But I will not abuse further, and I hope that I'll have more chances if you give me the floor again. Probably won't to continue this discussion and allow others to speak as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. I'm sure there will be further questions on the points that you've raised already from the floor. Dear Melinda, let me turn to you now. You've been back in the UK for a little while now after returning from Cape, but you also spent a lot of time in Ukraine, and a very specific kind of time, so the pandemic and the start of the full-scale invasion and the full-scale war. So you're both an insider and the outsider. So my first question to you is, do you think the perception of Ukrainian needs and the trust in Ukrainian experience and the way that Ukrainians communicate their needs has changed over the last 2 years among the political class in the UK, in other parts of the democratic world, but also the general public? Do you see a serious shift in understanding what Ukrainians are and also in the credibility that they're afforded?
Thank you, and thanks for having me this evening. It's good to be here. So I think the shift has been profound, actually. When I first arrived in Ukraine, pretty much most people couldn't tell me where that was in Europe, among the general public. And then among, political conversation, if we talked about Ukraine, it was pretty much in a regional context. It was about Russia and about EU expansion, or it was about NATO, or it was about thematic issues like corruption, but really there wasn't much focused conversation about Ukraine. So the war changed that completely, turned it completely on its head. And I know we talk about the war like it started in 2 years ago, when in fact it started much longer ago than that. But both the influx of Ukrainians into families, the Homes for Ukraine scheme, and the way in which Ukrainians interacted with families, and the extraordinary, very visible bravery and the compulsion to fight. I don't think the UK understood back in when the invasion first began that for Ukrainians, although of course lovely to have that love, there really wasn't any choice. You either fought or you could be killed. You fought or you could be occupied, and to be occupied, as we all understood when we went into places like Bucha, to be occupied was to be discriminated against, to be taken away, and to be killed. So for the Ukrainians, it's not a choice, but still the flocking of people to the fight, and the fight in all ways, so not just the military fight, but humanitarian, or people who stayed behind. And of course, some of the first people that we heard of being killed after the invasion were as much involved in humanitarian activity, trying to get people out of places of danger, as people in the trenches. So it's been profound, extraordinary, and I see it as a lasting thing, actually. But a lasting thing that was part of a trajectory anyway, because UK and Ukraine's relationship was getting closer and closer even before the war. We signed our strategic partnership agreement in December 2020. President Zelensky came to the UK. He met with Prince and Princess of Wales, and had an extraordinary reception back then before the war. And he and his team know very well how to create a platform out of that whereby they can increase the warmth of that relationship. So it was already on that trajectory, and it's been quite extraordinary to be part of something where back in 2019 I was explaining to people where Ukraine was on a map. Now when I go to these talks, people explain to me.
Well, I'm really pleased to hear such assessment. Mine probably slightly less optimistic, but I'm very glad to hear that this is your impression. The other question I wanted to ask you is about women in Ukraine. You speak so passionately about women's roles in the fight in and out of trenches, but also in the future rebuilding of the country, in current and future rebuilding of the country. Tell us a little bit more about the women that you met, the things that impressed you most of all, but also, have we given them enough visibility? I think I know the answer to the last question.
Okay, so this is where I'm not optimistic. But this is something that and I wasn't the only one, other women ambassadors particularly, fought very hard for a range of things. I mean, it's very clear that Ukraine is a very patriarchal country. So even, on arrival, there was evidence of that. And one of the first things, sadly, that I was part of was the UK was working with UNFPA to fund the construction of new domestic violence shelters in Kyiv, actually. And I remember having conversations with Khromeychuk in which he was explaining to me why the budget for addressing domestic violence in Kyiv was so low, and I was busy being quite one-dimensional with him about why we shouldn't be having this argument. He should just be putting more money that way and giving him statistics that demonstrated why that was. So even, it was a very low base when I first arrived, and I think also the perception of how women conduct themselves in most social contracts in Ukraine was a challenge then and remains a challenge. So I think even with all my memories of the war, still one of my toughest is talking to a 83-year-old woman in one of those domestic violence shelters who was black and blue down the side of her face. She'd been beaten up both by her husband and by her son, and was telling me that this was just a kind of normal, this had been a part of her life for as long as she'd been married and living in her home. And that's a set of perceptions that takes a really long time to undo. So there was that set of issues. And then, of course, those issues about how you protect women to be able to do what they want to do and be what they want to be then became exacerbated 100-fold by the war. And I'm still unconvinced that the stories of how women are being affected through attack and marginalisation are still not yet sufficiently told, in spite of the brilliant work that the Prosecutor General's Office is doing in gathering testimony of rape, for example. Too few women still come forward because it's more or less still a taboo issue inside Ukraine. And I'm afraid the very visible lack of women participating at the top of politics also sends that message, that women, the issues that affect women both in terms of how they can be protected, but also how they can participate in the rebuilding of the country, how they can participate in the economy, how they will rebuild their homes in the absence of their partners who may have lost their lives or indeed returned too traumatized to be able to work when they come back. All of that is still a massive work in progress. But I was given this brooch by women who work for Kiev City Administration. I love this brooch. I love it anyway, because what's not to love? It's really spangly and it's heart-shaped. Got blue and yellow on it. Absolutely love it. But I was given it as a thank you by the women who work at Kiev City Administration. And all through, even through the war, every other Monday they would meet and talk about building their careers, and they would invite someone in to come and talk with them about how to do this. So I went in to talk to them. I think it was very shortly after I'd returned to Kiev after being evacuated. I'd returned to Ukraine, maybe 2-3 weeks later. They all were still working in the administration building and discussing the barriers to their own progression and thinking about what they wanted to do about that. You know, at least twice an air raid siren went off during that meeting. They remain very determined. There are more than enough women who have the capabilities and the skills to be able to be part of that fabric, both in the defence of the country and also in the rebuilding of the country. And there are still many of them who aren't that interested in being held back in that endeavour. So that gives me hope.
Fantastic, and we need to support them for sure. And I'll be uncharacteristically optimistic and say that, you know, as someone who's studied participation of women, in particular in war effort, especially in the army, I've seen huge changes over the last 10 years or so. Massive empowerment of women, also a lot of women veterans speaking out, changing policy, changing attitudes in society, changing the way media represents them and so on. So it certainly gives me a lot of hope. Thank you. We'll come back to this question of women, I promise you. Nataliya, I'll turn to you now. You're an international correspondent. You've reported on different parts of the world for Ukrainian audiences, and you've reported on Ukraine for international audiences. I want to ask you whether you see any, again, shifts in reporting on Russia's war in Ukraine beyond Western Europe and the so-called global north, especially in the countries of the so-called global south. Are we managing to tell our story, and are we managing to explain that this is a neo-colonial, neo-imperial war that Russia's waging, or is there still a lot more work to be done, and how do we do it? Easy questions for you, Nataliya.
That's easy. Thanks a lot for that. Because I just finished the column for the major Korean daily, which would be there for the second year, and I was asked to write it. Mainly also seeing the potential to be understood in a lot of places. So probably starting that last year I had a chance to welcome to Ukraine like 3 groups of famous like intellectuals, journalists and senior editors from Latin America, Asia and Africa. And beyond that, I found like that, yes, this war is about everything. I don't think that Ukraine is solution for everything, but because it's so morally clear, because it's about one country against a giant, you know, about this David against Goliath, because it's about rule of law and justice, it really resonates in a lot of places. Oddly in a weird way, but it's also up to the Ukrainians as well find their way to communicate. I always insist on that for Ukrainians, it's also the time to listen. You know, we also were very much focused on ourselves. We didn't know the world well. So it's not really we are in the moment to tell, like, please support us, because solidarity, it's not really something which, you know, you ask. It's either there or not. But I saw this. So, for instance, as you know, when the Nicaraguan journalist would interview a peasant from Kherson, in 10 minutes he would say, like, that's exactly how people are tortured in the same way in Nicaragua. And the Argentinians would think about the trials in Junta, and Mexican would speak about, you know, mass graves in Sonora, going to Izum. And, you know, for the Singaporean, it would be very, very easy to understand the language issue, because I thought that this journalist once said, like, at first I was puzzled why these people in, who escaped atrocities from Russians were, complaining about Russia, and they were speaking Russian. But then I understood that actually, yes, I speak Chinese, and I understand how Taiwanese can be anti-Beijing. So oddly enough, and also very interesting that, of course, we are all very much concerned, and it was a very painful time for all of us, especially those who covered the Middle East to observe what's going on in Gaza since October the 7th. And so discussion was very different from summer, how Ukraine was trying to reach the countries elsewhere, and it shifted. It was all about this, global hypocrisy. But I still found out that for instance, for the colleagues from Asia, from Japan, from South Korea, from Indonesia, they would still think about, something else, a bigger war, about the idea how actually we can preserve ourselves from the big mighty force. They would be very, very curious about Ukrainian success in the Black Sea, where the country, which honestly doesn't have much of the fleet, managed to push back the Russian fleet close to the border, to their border. So I do think that we can't really just take it for granted that this is the thing. For the last, I think, months, again, all the talks are about, Trump coming to power, what Ukrainians do. Are they considering that? Of course they do. Ukrainians are now like really, really focused on how to deal with the Republican voters. To be honest, it's really a lot of heads in Kiev, and not just in Kiev, full of how to deal with that. But I see that the empathy is there. The empathy is there, and there are a lot of ways to connect. It's very important not just to particularly enforce some narrative. I think it's just like this human story is so powerful that the chances are there.
Yeah, I can't agree with you more. I'm just back from India. I was at the Jaipur Literary Festival, and I was so moved by the amount of enthusiasm, curiosity, and support that I received, especially from younger audiences, from students, really keen to understand Ukraine and admitting that they haven't had the chance to understand it properly. So totally agree, and especially human stories really work. So when Ukrainians talk about victory, they always talk about justice. And this is the second question I wanted to ask you. Your work, the Reckoning Project, it's described as something that brings together Ukrainian and international reporters, lawyers, and researchers to document Russian war crimes and ensure that testimonies from witnesses can be shared not only in the media, but also submitted to the courts of law. And that's a highly important work that is being done in pursuit of justice. Tell us a little bit more about that initiative, and also how we can support it.
So within the Reckoning Project, what we actually do, we talk to the direct survivors and the witnesses of the crimes, all people to whom we talk according to the specific methodology, which is kind of neutral. The way they speak, it could be, used by the lawyers, so we speak just with potentially people who can be on the trials. And then out of that, yes, there could be the movies, films, but also submissions to various, bodies, international bodies, but also we pass a huge chunk of data to the analytical part of it to the Ukrainian prosecutors. We published one of the first stories on the deportation of the Ukrainian children in 2022 still, and we were happy to see, we couldn't even expect that there would be this, some of the people we talked to later were, interviewed by international prosecutors. But to tell that, so what is probably the most important for us to say that my foreign colleagues who covered numerous wars and participate in the project, they all speak about the accountability and for past crimes. It's of course the case for us. For us, of course, as Ukrainians, it's extremely important to speak also about documenting these war crimes, but also speak about the prevention of the war. Because I strongly believe that it's not really the task now to prove that the crimes are there. They are there. But really there is this hypocrisy, or like, the idea that, you won't prosecute. It's too much. It would never happen. I think the arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin, just over a year after the full-scale invasion was a huge sign that, it's possible if you really want. And I also think that it's absolutely critical to do it in case of other things like the attacks on the civilian infrastructure. For us, it's very critical to prove that, it's not the collateral damage of the war. These are the crimes. and these are not just the tragedies, because the tragedies, it's something which makes us powerless, and the crimes really empower us to do and to investigate, and so we are very much moved. And probably I can't not to tell this story. Just recently, like a couple of days ago, I'm coming from Kiev today, I had to speak to one of our survivor, and I need to chat with a couple of hours with his wife. He was the volunteer in Berdyansk, the port in the south. From the very first day, he started just with his with a bus to bring people who were escaping from Mariupol to Zaporizhia. He was, after some months, abducted, and he was kept for 44 days, electrocuted, tortured, severely beaten. Later, they escaped. Our project, which is rather small, talked to a dozen of the people from the very same premise, and it's happening till now in that region. But all over the country, in south, in the east, in Izium or Kherson, we've been talking to hundreds of people who were electrocuted and tortured in the very, very same way. And as this man wife put it in very nice way, not in very smart way, she just said, like, it's enough to have your own opinion to be subjected to the torture. And that's probably the best way how she given me the example how to summarize this war and the scale of it. But at the same time, when I talk to her, I go on speaking and ask what they're doing now. They escaped. He's, by the way, Armenian by origin, grew up in Ukraine. He wouldn't live to Armenia. And they live in Zaporizhia, which is under the shelling. They rented 3 rooms in the basement to open the schools for the internally displaced. So because in Zaporizhia there are few bomb shelters, so schools are not operating, and they actually voluntarily teach people, math, in English, Ukrainian, and she's just seriously, fully speaking about the idea to open a kindergarten there. And when you see about these people who doing that after what they survive, you really understand that that's the way. But to finalize, I recently also had a chance to talk to Father Andriy, who is a priest of the church in Bucha. That was a church where the mass grave was, the first mass grave we all saw was there. He oversees a community, and now he's trying to explain to this community, that the justice would come, the justice is needed. Some people from his community already went to serve in the army. Some already died. And he really mentioned in this way, he just said like that, I'm explaining them that justice is our way and the revenge isn't our way. And for me as a Ukrainian, very clearly to understand what is our way, that it's not. And when we speak about this hypocrisy and disbelief in justice, I also should say that we all understand there would be few trials. There would be just some people persecuted. Out of now General Prosecutor Office registered 120,000 war crimes incident. We know they won't be all investigated in the end, but I think that Ukrainians understood that that's our way. The accountability is really something, and this is a way from Ukrainians not to think about the revenge. And it's already a very strong compromise with all acknowledgement. I think most of the people we talk, they all know that all of the perpetrators won't be persecuted, but at least this will should be appreciated and respected, that we also understand that these people already compromise this idea and they are not calling for revenge, and that should be also understood. Therefore, the justice must to be supported in any way.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank you for your work as well. Nataliya will be screening in partnership with the UGB London 3 of the films tomorrow night at 155 Holland Park. You can check the details online on our website, and Nataliya will be there to answer your questions should you be able to come to the screenings tomorrow. Christina, you've been very patient. Thank you so much. Finally, your turn now to address the audience. We saw each other in Lviv in October. And on the 7th of October, I think we said goodbye. And you went to the Middle East, is that right? As many of your colleagues did. And of course, all wars should be covered. wherever they are in the world. But my experience and that of some of my colleagues was after the 7th of October that I was approached by several newspaper editors asking me to comment on what it feels like to compete for attention with Israel-Gaza war. And as far as I know, most of my colleagues refused to participate in that competition of human suffering. But there was certainly this kind of appetite for competition for headlines, at least coming from the media. What I want to ask you is what bothers me a lot. What I think I noticed this over the last year especially. It's the consumption of war news, a little bit like that of a Netflix addict looking for new series to binge on. So as media professionals, as people who report from these places where you meet real people, hear real stories, devastating stories, how do we snap people out of this passive consumption of war news? How do we make them realize that A, it matters to pay attention to it, it's not Netflix series, it's real people's lives, but B, also they have a say in the outcome of these wars. They have agency they can exercise even if they're really, really far away and it feels like it's not their war.
Thank you. Yeah, that day, October the 7th, I remember getting all the breaking news things on my phone and my heart sinking, and then getting a call from my editor who literally said, "You're in the wrong war." And actually I insisted on staying in Ukraine the first week because I was working on a specific thing about landmines, and it had taken a long while to set up, and I had people expecting me in a particular place, and I didn't want to let them down, so I didn't go for the first week after that. Look, this is horrible. I hate the idea that there's some kind of, sort of Champions League of horror stories and atrocities, and that, some things are neglected in favor of others. But unfortunately, we have very limited resources in the media. And I have never known a time like this. I mean, the UN says that there are more conflicts than at any time since the Second World War. Certainly when I started out covering war 36 years ago, and the first thing I ever covered was the Russian occupation, Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. So it feels a bit circular going to Ukraine. At that time, everything seemed to be going in a good direction. The Berlin Wall had just come down. Apartheid had ended in South Africa. Dictatorships were collapsing in Latin America. And so it felt as if everything was moving in a good direction, even if I was still covering certain conflicts. It doesn't feel like that at all now. And, frankly, it is really difficult to be able to cover all the things that are going on. I get really angry messages all the time from people from Darfur saying, why is nobody covering Sudan? And people think it's a conspiracy. They think we're deliberately choosing not, but it isn't really. We just don't have the resources. And it's not just the media. I mean, international community doesn't have the bandwidth to be able to deal with all of these things. So it is frustrating. I think there was, after October the 7th, this huge focus on the Middle East, and fortunately now it's sort of gone back to covering Ukraine as well. We certainly feel, I work for the Sunday Times, there's a lot of interest from readers about Ukraine. People want to know what's happening, and I mean, I don't really like the fact that everything we do is now measured by how many clicks and how much dwell time people have, but editors do know what people want to read. And we do see that there is still a lot of interest in Ukraine. We don't really see that horrible expression, Ukraine fatigue. So that is a good thing. But it is difficult when stories or conflicts go on for a certain amount of time, because people feel like they've sort of read that before, and so there's much more challenge to us to be able to find new ways of reporting on things, and to get people to care about the issues. And this isn't your question, but just wanted to comment on, I thought what Nataliya said was really interesting about revenge. And I remember, focus a lot about what's happened to women in Ukraine, but also children. And I was at a school in Irpin, and the air raid siren went off literally. I had just gone in. I just started speaking to the headmaster. The school had just reopened. And I said, you know, what happens when there's air raid sirens? And one started as we spoke. So all the children were clearly very used to it. They all grabbed their backpacks and coats and went down into the basement and sat there. I started talking to one of the teachers about how difficult it was teaching when it's constantly being interrupted like that. And she also said, you know, that often parents then come and take their children. And she started crying, and she said to me, I'm really worried that these children will grow up hating. And she said to me, I think that it's our biggest challenge as teachers in Ukraine today. So, sorry, that was a bit off what you asked me, but.
Very important story, and I did say that we'd come back to the question of women, and I'd like to ask you a little bit more about that. Your book, Our Bodies, Their Battlefield, deals so powerfully with the effects that wars have on women's lives. And when I speak to Ukrainian servicewomen, just to remind the audience here, maybe not everybody knows, there's about 60,000 servicewomen in the Ukrainian armed forces at the moment. That's a huge number, massive increase since 2022. They, of course, complain about the various obstacles that they face, including a sort of patriarchal culture institutionally and in society, and the uniforms that don't fit female bodies, although that's finally changing. But they always emphasize that the biggest enemy for them is the misogynistic enemy that they're facing on the battlefield. It's Russia. And we've all seen the scale of conflict-based sexual violence perpetrated by the Russian troops in Ukraine. So I suppose this is an open question. What sort of stories do you think we could be covering to understand that experience that war has on women, both in and out of trenches?
Sure. I mean, I guess being a female war correspondent, I've always focused on what happens to women in war. And I think, to me, women are the real heroes in war, because I'm not really so interested in the fighting. The fighting's part of the story, of course, but I think how people live during a war, how they keep their life together, how they keep feeding and schooling their children, protecting the elderly, getting married, going to work. I think often people outside look at war on TV and they think it's just the fighting, and they don't think about the millions of people that are still trying to live, and that's usually the women trying to keep them together. Though, of course, in Ukraine, a lot of the women have also left. And so I feel that the women are real heroes, and you see a lot of resilience. People often say to me, like, don't you get depressed going to all these bad places and seeing all the bad things that you see? And I always say no, because actually you see people doing incredible things in these places, and it gives you more faith in humanity because you see the resilience. And Ukraine is an extremely good example of that. And I've met women doing all sorts of incredible things, and you know, a flautist from the orchestra now being a drone pilot, and all sorts of people, child psychologists now on the front line, helping people deal with combat stress, even though they had no training and were literally having to sort of Google and watch videos and things at night to be able to learn how to deal with it. So, and that's going to be interesting, how that affects society, sort of going back to what Melinda was saying, because I do find it slightly, although President Zelensky is such an astonishing leader and hero, but he generally does appear with a band of men around him. And so it's interesting how all that may change society in the future. But there's also this bad side of what happens to women in war, and that is the use of sexual violence. And unfortunately, we have seen that on a large scale in Ukraine. At the beginning, when I first heard reports early on, I was a little bit dubious. I'd written in my book about what the Russians did during the liberation of Berlin, and the millions of rapes of women there and women across Eastern Europe. And I couldn't really believe that it would be the same thing again in 2022. But sadly, it was. And I've spoken to some of the women who were raped by Russian soldiers, and really horrific stories. Now, this is very difficult because, as was said, not that many of them have actually come forward and officially reported, because rape, as we all know, it's the one crime where the victim is often made to feel that they did something wrong, and that's generally all over the world. That often happens, and the whole discussion, what were you wearing, and were you sort of leading the person on. But it's certainly in Ukraine, the culture has made women feel that they can't speak out about it. So some of the women I've spoken to have not officially reported, and that's a shame, because I kind of hoped at the beginning, when these reports started coming out, and for the first time I have ever seen, this was widely reported in all media, and also the government spoke about it openly. That's very rare. I mean, only a few years ago, I was reporting on war rape in other countries, and my foreign editor at Sunday Times literally said to me, "Nobody wants to read about this, it's too horrible." And I said, well, our job is to expose uncomfortable things. But so fortunately, that's changed things, and I think Ukraine has changed that, and I was happy to see President Zelensky talking about the rape in the same breath as the killing and torture, which is often not the case. But I also see at the same time, where are all the resources to investigate this, and what actually is happening, and where is the help for the survivors? And so I think there's been a lot more talk than there has been action.
Beyond the NGOs that are working on this, and there are some fantastic NGOs in Ukraine that are working with survivors.
There are some really impressive people, but I think it could be a lot more.
For sure. Thank you, Christina. Rory, let's talk about Crimea. Back in 2014, I think we were on the same panel soon after the occupation of Crimea, that we both heard from some people, many people, saying it's a done deal, and it was seen as a done deal for quite a long time. And even this time last year, I think there was still quite a lot of skepticism whether Ukraine should be targeting Crimea, whether it should be contemplating deoccupying it, and so on. So my question is very simple. The war started in Crimea. Should it end in Crimea?
That's certainly what Crimean Tatar dissident and prisoner Nariman Jalal, and then later after him, President Zelensky themselves have both said, that Russia's war against Ukraine began in Crimea, and it will end in Crimea with its liberation. And I think at the outset, I want to be present to a couple of paradoxes, because when we talk about the future of Ukraine, of course, we're talking about Ukraine's future. That is a future that's dependent on Ukrainian voices, Ukrainian aspirations, Ukrainian actions. It's important, I think, for me to say up here as an American who works at a British university, for instance. But the other element of the paradox is, of course, that Ukraine's future is our future. Ukraine's fight for democracy, for freedom, is our same fight for democracy and freedom. The same force that has been trying to level Ukrainian cities with genocidal aggression is the same force that's been trying to undermine and divide this society, European societies more broadly. So we all face that same threat. The other paradox is, of course, the question of knowing about the future. Of course, we can't know, no matter what probabilistic forecasters and U.S. analysts tell us about the next year ahead. I always find that war is not so much about strategy and tactics, but also this horrific march of contingencies and accidents. So we have to be aware that we can't know, but we're certainly here this evening trying to understand and to know, so as to make responsible decisions about our present. So when it comes to Crimea, of course, it's the ground zero of Russia's aggression. As you mentioned earlier, Olesya, the beginning of this war was February 2014, with Russia's operation to seize the peninsula militarily.
In February 2022, the war escalated to a full-scale invasion launched in part from Crimea. And that led to particularly President Zelensky, to speak about the importance of the liberation of Crimea. This pivotal position Crimea has isn't reflected in our mainstream media discourse. We don't see a consistent, steady focus on Crimea, and that's a big problem. And I think here we have to confront some narrative biases against Ukraine related to this war. These biases are many. We're all storytelling animals, as the literary scholar Jonathan Bradshaw puts it. Others call us pattern people. We're looking for signals amid the noise, and we're often prone to making these kind of teleological conclusions about world events. And I think we see that very often now in, for instance, US and to a degree European reactions to Russia's aggression. That is, if you take the example of Jake Sullivan and Biden's administration, there's a certain understanding that escalation management with Russia is possible. That is, they think in terms of mitigating and navigating these massive uncertainties, this chaos unleashed by Russia's war, through probabilities, through calculated risks. And I think this is a kind of intellectual naivete that we need to get over, because behind all these probabilities is a story. It's a story we often tell ourselves about Russian power, about Russian intentions, about Russian threats. That is, the story is always about Russia. It's rarely about Ukraine. And this radically needs to change, because part of this story involves a certain thing related to Crimea, certain narrative threads that pertain to Crimea. The first is that somehow Crimea has more importance historically, culturally, to Russia than it does to Ukraine. The second assumption, the second thread, is that if Ukraine strikes on the peninsula, that it will constitute some sort of crossing of a red line. And that third, Crimea's deoccupation and the destruction of the Black Sea Fleet will unleash a third World War and a nuclear exchange. If you listen to John Mearsheimer or Samuel Chara, amateur armchair generals like Elon Musk, they all say the same thing, or they imply it. Over the last 2 years, we've seen that this story is a complete fiction. And the real story, which we can substantiate with plenty of evidence, is that, first of all, Crimea needs Ukraine to thrive. As a historical matter, it's always needed Ukrainian territory more than Russian territory. And it's important for us to remember that Crimea is not attached to Russia naturally. And we've seen throughout history that a Crimea that's occupied by Russia sees so much ethnic cleansing and violence. And a Crimea that's detached from Ukraine suffers an economic and social decline. It's a very clear historical reality that we need to face. So what we're seeing right now is a deoccupation taking place of Crimea. It may seem kind of hard to see because of all this conventional wisdom, but it's taking place, it's happening. 40%, or roughly 40% of naval tonnage of the Russian Black Sea Fleet has been destroyed. Much of the Black Sea Fleet has left Sevastopol for the deep sea port of Novorossiysk on Russia's internationally recognized territory. Obviously, vessels like the Cesar Khulnikov that loiter around the Crimean coast are being sunk and destroyed by Ukrainian sea drones. So that's understanding. I think, Olesya, for our purposes today, necessitates a kind of action on our part, and that is to expect and demand more stories about Crimea, and for our part as well to learn more about the peninsula. We need to know about Jankoy, for instance, which is a major military logistical point in Crimea, as well as places like Sevastopol. We know about the Kerch Bridge connecting Russia's Taman Peninsula to the Black Sea Peninsula. But we need to know about the Chonhar Bridge, the Sivash Bridge, the other bridges that will be, I think, geostrategically significant over the months and years to come. And this is something that President Zelensky has said, that Crimea will be an increased target of military activity in 2024. So while this military deoccupation is underway, I think it's incumbent on us to engage in a kind of cognitive or cultural decolonization of Crimea. That is, we need to be studying the history of Russian settler colonialism on the Crimean Peninsula. The settler colonialism is taking place right now in all parts of occupied Ukraine. So Russia is actively colonizing, bringing in settlers from outside of this territory. And they've been doing that through their history for far too long. And we in the West have, I think, underestimated and understudied this very phenomenon. And it also makes it very important for us, I think, to listen sensitively to Ukrainian and Crimean Tatar voices on the peninsula that have been calling out for generations, calling out for us to listen. So I'd leave it there, Olesya.
Thank you so much for this outline. I'm sure we'll come back to the question of Crimea in the discussion. And just before I open the floor, the last question from me, it's sort of going full circle to the beginning of the discussion, the main changes that we've seen over the last 2 years in particular, and something that Melinda's already touched on to some degree. I have this concern that Ukraine has most certainly become visible to the rest of the world, but I'm not entirely sure if it's become understood. What is your take on that? And if you broadly agree with that concern, what can we do to ensure that it does become understood? Yes, please.
Okay. It pertains to the last point I made about listening. Sometimes I think when we revisit this question of awareness of Ukraine, we put the pressure on Ukrainians to have to say quite a lot about who they are and what they want. And the fact of the matter is there have been plenty of texts for centuries that have said so. If one goes back to the 18th century, 16th century, you actually see European audiences knowing a lot more about Ukraine on its own terms than we do now. They published throughout Europe many maps about Ukraine. You could use these maps today to travel through the country. So I think really in terms of understanding, it just puts the, I think, onus on us to listen closely, to learn the Ukrainian language, to learn other languages of Ukraine. I mentioned Crimean Tatar as an important language that I think has been too often underestimated and ignored. And that way, I think, we get to a better understanding. And I do think it's changing, and I've seen from students so much enthusiasm, a real thirst for knowledge over many years, but particularly now. And I think it will be sustained. But at the same time, I don't want to be naive and just take it for granted. And that's where I think we need constant maintenance of this awareness and great initiatives from, for instance, the Ukrainian Institute, which is always doing things to keep that fresh perspective alive. So that's where I'd be there.
Thank you. Thank you for the plug of the Ukrainian Institute's work. And if you want to learn Ukrainian language, we have classes in Ukrainian literature and history and so on. Finally, opening the floor to all of you. You've been very, very patient. Thank you so much. I'm going to collect a couple of questions at a time. Please introduce yourselves. Please remember that we are recording this discussion. It will be uploaded to our YouTube channel. Let us know if your question is for somebody specific on the panel or it's a general question, and please make it a question. And if you absolutely have to share a comment, keep it brief. Thank you. There's a mic. There's a mic that will be roaming somewhere here. Right. Okay. Let's begin with this side of the room because I feel like I've neglected you looking at the panel. Any questions from this side of the room? We can collect. Ooh, yes, there's one there. Fantastic. Oh, please wait for the mic. Just 1 second, because we need this for recording. And okay, there you go. Can I ask Phoebe? There you go. Right. I think it is on actually this time.
I can speak quite loudly.
Please do.
Hamish Mackay is my name. I guess my question really is for the EU ambassador and the former British ambassador to Ukraine. I'm so pleased to hear that we're now hearing more about, or less about as long as it takes, more about whatever it takes. And I think I heard David Cameron utter the word win this morning. But we're not much closer to hearing that sort of language from the White House. What efforts are being made, if any, I mean, it seems that the leadership is really starting to come from Europe in this regard to get the US to think in those terms as well.
Fantastic, thank you. I'm writing these down so you don't need to. Any other questions from this part of the room? Not yet. What about here? Yes, there's a question just there. Phoebe, just there.
Hi. My name's Anna Bowles. For want of a better term, I describe myself as an independent humanitarian.
I've spent some time in the past year travelling around Ukraine, including in the east and the south. And what I've noticed is that Western aid isn't really making it to some of the places that need it most, the places that are deoccupied, for example. If you talk to people there, then sometimes they will say, "What aid?" and look, roll their eyes at you. So I was wondering, in terms of the future of Ukraine, how will you avoid a situation where Kiev essentially becomes a member of the EU and the rest of the country falls behind?
Anybody in particular you'd like to address that question?
Just
Nathalie,
anyone
maybe
who's
you can
interested in
comment on
answering.
some of those? Yeah, great, fantastic. Any more questions there? Just there, gentlemen, just behind.
Evening. I'm Slava Gromluk. My question is that Shadov from Ukrainian embassy said that the victory of Ukraine should be achieved on battlefield. Do you agree with that view, or do you think that peace formula can be achieved by other means?
Fantastic. Let's begin with those. So the first question was on the US. Dear Melinda, Ambassador, would you like to tackle that?
Sure. You want to start? I'm happy.
So, since I've been decompressing since I came back from Ukraine and not working on Ukraine in the Foreign Office, it will be hard to comment on how the UK is working with the US on their own approach. But there are other comments I think I can make. First of all, I think it's been incredibly important that David Cameron has continued with very strong statements that are very clear. I think actually the extraordinary thing is that all of our ministers, all our prime ministers and our foreign ministers over this last 2 years, so that's like about 6 actually in total, have all had one thing in common, which is that they have been consistently clear about what should happen and how the UK would support it. And of course, Rishi Sunak announced our military assistance for this year, which I think very transparently, obviously, wasn't just about showing UK continuity, but also there to galvanise others. And so you can be sure that that will have been part of the conversation that the UK would have been having with the US. But actually, I think the interesting thing is the US ambassador in Ukraine and how she is communicating on social media about Ukraine as a measure, really, both of what she represents, but also the conversation she herself must be having with her capitals. I noticed, for example, that she commented about the air raids this morning and that huge crater that was left by a Russian missile that hit Kiev region, and why she said very clearly Ukraine continues to need all of our support. So I find that quite interesting, because that will have been her both assuring people of the message, but also lobbying on the message. So from that I take that there is as much going on inside the US system as there is from other systems into the US system.
Thank you. Can you borrow your mic? Because we've given ours to the audience.
Thank you very much. I think from day one, there's been a very strong cooperation between the European Union, United Kingdom, the US, a lot of cooperation within G7. There's been coordination in NATO frameworks as well, and important discussions. So, but yes, there is a special protagonism from the EU and from the UK, because this is happening in Europe. And this is, we have a main responsibility in addressing this, and many of the support that can be provided would be provided to Europe. Where do refugees from Ukraine go? They go to Europe. You go to your neighboring country. It is our duty to support Ukraine. And of course, we're the first to be affected by the consequences of this war. So I think for us in the European Union, certainly it's been not only a huge test, but also it's been more than a wake-up call to know that we have immense challenges, that we have to face up to those challenges, that we have to ramp up our production of means of defense, and that we have to support it. But no doubt as well that the role of the United States continues to be key, that we receive from the US, the President, from the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, strong commitment as well on their side to continue supporting Ukraine, and we expect and hope that all this support, also of course in full cooperation with our friends in the UK, will continue, and that's how we look at this right now. Thank you.
Thank you. Nataliya, you travel so much around the country. I know you come to the most inaccessible parts of Ukraine. Can you comment on this idea that aid being delivered to those places that need it most?
It's not definitely enough, but I also should say that there is extraordinary effort done, but mainly by the Ukrainian organization, like the guys from Chernigiv who are feeding Kherson, electricians and the other office workers and the others. I also think it would be fair to understand that, unfortunately, like the large international organization, they are not really working that much in Ukraine. They are the first Ukrainian organization. They are Western funds. But like the people who really deliver, who come, who are there, they are more fast, they're more robust, and they are more present. If you really speak about the international organizations who actually like overtake huge chunk of funds. But if to answer your question, I don't think it's really, the risk is there. I think in all the mindset about the reconstruction and rebuilding, there is a discussion about decentralization, and like there is quite a strong push that in the end there should be the communities to decide, there should be redistribution. In the end, Ukraine is rather big, and it's not that centralized as like many of the some of the countries, but it should be taken into account. So it's really, I think this decentralization is the answer. But if to go to a second question about the peace, I think that, first of all, there are no signs in Moscow, neither in rhetoric, in where there is this genocidal call is just a routine of every day. There is no sign of the, if we speak about the actions, about any kind of other way rather than military. On the contrary, when our sources speak to what's happening in the mindset of the Russian generals, they're pretty excited and speaking about the escalation, which is totally contrary to what is somehow managed to be sent to some of the channels in the West. And I also think that it's pretty wishful, and that's when I think you ask what is the biggest misunderstanding. I think there is a wishful thinking and very theoretical, like the question I ask usually from the editors, they are very theoretical from possible ceasefire, which we know won't happen, which we won't happen. While the discussion in Ukraine is about totally different things. It's about how to make army efficient, how all of a sudden you have the country where you have millions of people who never served being in the army. How do you, have the economy in which the economy should be economy, which funds the military from the taxpayers' money? How you really rebuild the whole economy in the way when the big towns, industrial towns like Kharkiv and the others, won't be any longer the cities, that there would be total reshuffle. So the discussion on the ground is very, very different from these talks. So I think it's misleading. As somebody also, I covered the Minsk agreement, and to be honest, I was the one who actually believed for some time in that it's doable. And we understand that it was a trap to militarize Crimea, to militarize the Donbass. And the question I'm again asked often as well, like for how long Ukrainians would ask for, weapon. And I would say that for as long as it's necessary, and I'm not ashamed, because it's our duty, because if you see this crater as today morning near Kiev, if there won't be, any kind of this ballistic missile can destroy the whole neighborhood, and if you see that the Western weapon can save lives, you will ask, because it's a duty to do that for as long as it possible, which is probably also to say that it's #1 issue. And I clearly would agree with our colleagues that if you really think about one thing which is urgent now, it's really the lack of the ammunition.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Let's collect some more questions. Let's turn to this part of the room, please. Yes, sir, up there.
It's green. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. My name is Robin Jowett. I'm not a journalist and I'm not a teacher, but I went there last year to visit 7 schools, and at these schools I observed, as I think you know, about 90% of the teachers are women. Now, they are doing a wonderful job because despite their own personal issues, looking after their families, partners away fighting, and having to look after the children who are traumatized in many of the schools. In the talks I've been giving to raise money, I always say the heroes are the female teachers there, about 90%. So my question to the 3 of you here is, What work is being done, if any, if it can be done, to give some consolation and treatment and help to the teachers who themselves are suffering in a very bad way, which none of us really know about or understand?
Thank you very much. Any other questions? There's a question at the front and one in the middle.
My name is Olga. I am a manager of English school for displaced Ukrainians in Ukrainian Institute London. And my question is actually about the future of displaced Ukrainians all over the Europe and UK, because less than in 13 months, the program Homes for Ukraine is going to be like, it's like deadline, and there are still no decisions. And there are a lot of uncertainty for displaced Ukrainians, which are mostly women, mothers with children, and it's really hard to make any plans, any commitments. It's getting harder and harder to get funding for English school. It's getting harder and harder to get any help and support for Ukrainians everywhere. Especially there is a crisis, accommodation crisis. So what do you think EU and UK and other countries can help and encourage other countries to provide ongoing support for displaced Ukrainians who doesn't have home to come back to?
Thank you so much. And there was a question just there, lady with a hand up.
Thank you. My name is Abby Semple, and I had the privilege of working in Ukraine in 2016-17 on public procurement reform. But my question is actually about sanctions. My question to any or all of you is, why haven't the sanctions against Russia been more effective? And what can we do to make them more effective? Because before we get into a massive arms race with Russia, we might want to double down on what we're doing economically. Thank you.
Wonderful. So we've got three questions. One of women's stories, especially children's stories, being covered and receiving more visibility. Displaced Ukrainians in the UK and EU and elsewhere. And sanctions. Who would like to take which? Fantastic.
Thank you. Thank you. Right, works. Okay, so one of the interesting things that I found when I was visiting schools, which I did a lot in during the war, so in Chernihiv, actually everywhere I went, but wherever I was kind of cleared as being safe to go, I would go to these schools, and one of the things that struck me about them was that they had become more than schools, because they had become centres for people who were still living in those areas, partly because in the first phase of the invasion, school basements were very often where people took shelter. And I'm talking about the kind of 4 to 6 weeks at a time that people spent in basements in that first phase of the war. So I'm not talking now about air raid sirens, but where people were forced to spend long periods of time. And so it changed their relationship with those buildings. And quite often when I would visit those schools, and they were now busy digging out bomb shelters, which became mandatory in order to reopen the schools to children, you'd find the entire community down there with picks and shovels. And more than once I came across women who were not teachers and were not employees of the school, but they had lost a son in the fight and had come to help in order to restore some meaning, really, to themselves and to their community. I even lost count of the number of women I came across who would tell me that story, that they'd lost a male member of their family close to them, and this was a way of restoring some sense for themselves. So actually, I think that the central importance of schools goes beyond those teachers, even though you're completely right to talk of them. As for them themselves, there is I think quite extraordinary, actually, as I think a lot of international support, we are forgetting how extraordinary so much of it is, and I think sanctions too have been extraordinary in the extent to which they've gone and will continue to need to go. But on this point, extraordinary the way many countries have come together to focus on schools in order both to help children and teachers to be able to be there, but also as a way of trying to create an environment where women who either decide they've got no choice but to return to the country or would want to return to the country can see that there may be a secure way to do that. I mean, people need a home, they need basic infrastructure so they can get about, and they need a school that they know will be safe. So the UK, for example, has an integrated fund that will go around repairing windows and helping dig out bomb shelters and do stuff in partnership with Ukrainians. But the UK is one of about 15 different countries doing that. And there is also quite interesting private sector partnership developing for it. So oddly enough, although there are enormous psychological issues, that some of which have already been referred to, and there are still funding gaps, and the range and level of damage to many of those schools remains a huge rebuilding challenge. I actually think it's one of the sectors where I've seen the most progress and have the most hope. That said, as with everything, it's an ongoing thing. And the difficulty, not just women teachers actually, but frankly women everywhere who are in Ukraine, holding down a job while they are the only member of their family, adult member of their family, able to look after things. The sorts of pressures that teachers are feeling are the sorts of pressures, if I'm honest, that I think Ukrainian women ministers are feeling too, and that Ukrainian, entrepreneurial women are feeling. They are all having to deal with that combined trauma, needing to make a living, to be empowered to do that, to deal with the trauma that they see as a result of it, and manage their family.
Thank you. Ambassador, you volunteered to answer both the question on displaced Ukrainians and sanctions.
Yes, thank you. On displaced Ukrainians, we are hosting in EU member states, I think up to 4 million right now. There were more initially, some returned afterwards to Ukraine. And there's I think this is part of whatever it takes, as long as it takes. And the support, I don't have a concrete, I don't know if you're talking about any deadline or anything that may happen, but certainly in the European Union, I'm sure that that the Ukrainians are going to continue to be welcomed, that there's going to continue to be support. Can't remember right now, I think it's up to 20 billion. I don't take but I think it's around 20 billion in terms of support given to the displaced Ukrainians so far by the European Union. This support will continue. So there, I don't see any changes on our side, and everything is being done to try to make their lives as welcoming as possible. I think that's the intention, definitely, and the wish to continue with this. On sanctions, the most ambitious sanctions ever of any sort are being imposed on Ukraine. There have been different rounds, each round increasing the level of pressure, each round also trying to cut any means of circumvention of sanctions. We have been engaging with partners because, of course, sanctions, you only impose sanctions on what you control, which is your own economy and those actors that are operating within your own economy. And that's what we've been trying to do with the partners that have joined in sanctions. Not all the world has joined in sanctions, of course, and there are countries with whom Russia continues to have relations. We've been one of we believe that Russia thought that because there were dependencies on gas, on oil, that they would have almost impunity. Well, I think right now, if I'm not wrong, we've managed to cut all need for supplies from gas from Russia, and we have diverted. We have obtained alternative sources for. And oil is a very mobile issue and difficult and easy actually to hide in many different ways. But we'll also establish caps on oil prices. So we're trying to attack all possible avenues to reduce certainly the capability of Russia to wage a war. Russia is a country that is rich in fuel and in gas, and of course this gives it an advantage. But bearing in mind that advantage, I think the most serious set of sanctions have been put. We have even envoys, particularly we have an envoy coordinating also and traveling the world to try to close any loopholes and to prevent circumvention as much as possible. So I think the effort definitely is of a magnitude that is unprecedented. Efforts, the results, they're not immediate. The results on sanctions are not necessarily immediate on all sides. That's why we have to remain vigilant. We have to continue adapting. We're I think, going to adopt a 13th package of sanctions quite soon, which is in the making. So yes, we're doing, I think, everything that can be done to limit the capacity of Russia to wage the war. Yes, it can still wage the war. Yes, it has changed its economy into a war economy, which is something that you can only do if you are an autocracy, and if you have means like they have through gas and oil. But so there are special circumstances in Russian economy that make it also particularly resilient to a certain extent. But we believe that there's going to be a hard impact on the Russian economy that is going to be felt quite soon, and we will continue the strength and determination of our sanctions, and it is going to have even a bigger impact than what it has already had, because they've had to change actually their model of their economy, which is not something you do very easily, and you do it at a price. The price will be the price paid by the Russian citizens. Thank you.
Thank you. This will be the last round of questions, but we will have a reception after, so you will be able to speak to our speakers and amongst yourselves as well after. So I noticed a hand just there and here, and I'll collect a few more. Yeah. Two more questions. Two more questions.
Nina Curiata, Tortoise Media. My question is, first of all, to Pedro Serrano as well, again, but anybody else is welcome to join. And it's following the topic you've just started. So I've been writing a piece about the 2 years of war, and I've calculated that the European Union has paid to Russia for its fossil fuel for 2 recent years 4 times more money than it gave to Ukraine as a military aid. And also, we all know that Viktor Orban is blocking sanctions against Russia, and he is blocking the military aid to Ukraine. So I listened carefully for everything you've just said, but are there any concrete mechanisms to change this balance of power and money to Ukrainians' favor? Thank you.
Thank you. And there was a gentleman here.
Thomas Brayford. I'm a regular at the Ukraine protest in London. One of the shining lights since the full-scale invasion has been the Estonian Prime Minister, Kaja Kallas. Estonians, of course, have lived experience and fully understand the threat of Russia. Kallas has committed 0.25% of its GDP to Ukraine's defense over the next 4 years and calls on allies to do the same. I believe it's important too. My question is, can it be done?
Fantastic. So we'll begin with you, Ambassador, if you don't mind, but then I'd like to offer all of you a chance to say some final remarks as well, and then we'll wrap up, I promise.
I don't know what numbers you're using, and there's no doubt that you cannot just close the tap from one day to another. When you have been receiving gas and oil from Russia, it's not something that you just do overnight and then you have your economy suffering. So it's been, but the effort has been done to an unprecedented extent to cut completely the purchase of any fossil fuel from Russia. I think the progress done in that has been immense over the last years. We have changed completely our supply chains, certainly for gas. And oil is a more complex story also because it can come. It's a fungible material, so it can. Do you really know where you're buying oil from? We're trying to learn certainly, and we're trying to cut everything that we can not to purchase hydrocarbons from Russia. We've increased renewables immensely in the European Union. We have now 40% of renewables, and cut our gas dependencies. I think the effort done in this, and we've increased as well our efficiency in terms of, and lowered our costs. So I think I don't know whether you get those numbers, but I do think that, and I'm very happy to look into other numbers that might be more interesting to you that reflect more clearly the reality of the immense effort and success that the European Union has done in changing its supply in hydrocarbons and lowering any kind of the price or any kind of thing that may be a support to Russia's economy. And this is what we're doing. We'll continue doing. What was the
defense? Estonian.
Oh, defense. There is clearly an acknowledgement of the need to increase defense spending to now the levels. You know, it's. I will not comment on levels. I think there's a 2.5 target in NATO, and I think that's the target most countries are aiming to fulfill. I think in the last years, I don't have the numbers here right now, but The defense has increased also in unprecedented manner in NATO states, most of them or many of them European Union member states, and there's no doubt and that we're all convinced that we have to continue doing this, and not only increase spending, but also increase our capacity for production and our industry and our technological development. The European Union will be presenting a defense industry strategy in March. And we have developed different kind of financial instruments to encourage member states also to produce jointly, to develop capabilities jointly, because it increases the effectiveness and lowers the costs. So a lot of efforts are being done in that regard, and this is something that will not disappear. We're going down this road, and we will continue advancing in this manner. Thank you.
Thank you. May I invite Christina, you go to the other side of the panel to offer some final thoughts, remarks.
Sure. I mean, the discussion, or the title of this discussion was The Future of Ukraine. Next week will be 2 years since the full-scale invasion. In that time, going back and forth reporting, I've seen a big change in the first year. There was very high morale, the feeling that the Russians had been driven back. The last year's been very different because there were, I guess, exaggerated hopes about the counteroffensive, and then that hasn't achieved what people hoped. The Russians still control at least 18% of Ukraine's territory. There's been very little difference from over the last year. Although having said that, I take what you said, Rory, about what's happened in Crimea, and I think we don't report that enough. But, you know, the fact is, it's not going as well as people hoped on the battlefield. And the big elephant in the room, which we haven't really discussed, is the US and the fact that what's happening with the lack now of US support, and what's going to happen with the elections. And if Trump wins, he has clearly said that he will not continue the support. In fact, he's said worse things than that. So, you know, the big question is Europe really going to step up? You know, we've heard from Pedro about the commitment and everything that the EU wants to do. But, you know, frankly, it's not enough. And I, like all other journalists who've gone and reported on the front line, have, you know, met so many really incredibly brave people fighting there who endlessly tell us, you're giving us enough to fight the war, but not enough to win. And that's got to change if this is going to be successful, I think.
Thank you. Melinda.
Thanks. So I think I'd want to end on 2 points. One is Crimea. I agree that with Rory's assessment that Crimea was ground zero for Russian invasion, but it's also been a centre for Russian oppression. And ever since that first invasion into Crimea, much of what is now being done at scale has been being done in Crimea to Crimean Tatars, but not just Tatars. Anyone waving a Ukrainian flag, anybody speaking Ukrainian, would effectively disappear. And of course, some of those Crimean prisoners of war, prisoners of war, forgive me, political prisoners, who were exchanged, Sentsov is a good example, have described things that we now see happening at scale. And there is a lot to talk about how much Crimea has become not just a militarized center, but a center into which Ukrainians, including many of those 20,000 Ukrainian children, have disappeared. So there's much still to be told that will speak as much to justice as to broader Russian playbooks. That's the first thing. And then the second thing is, so I'm often asked, what do we do at this point? What do we do to keep US interest high? And what do we do to guard against Ukraine fatigue? And what do we do to help keep up Ukrainian morale? And my blood boils a little bit like the Ukrainian acting ambassador, but actually the answer is a really boring one and consists of events like this, which is that we must continue to talk about it. We must continue to talk about it among each other and publicly. One of the things I noticed about my social media was that nothing annoyed the Russians more than calling things out, than saying things for what they were. I still remember that tweet that I put out on sexual violence, my first tweet about the widespread rape of women and girls, which had become clear after Butcher. made Russian commentators so angry it got a half-hour debate on one of their propaganda channels, which I thought was a huge success. But it is, because even as rampant, if you like, as the invasion is, there are, the narrative is something that Russia is absolutely clear it wants to, needs to keep hold of, and we see these waves of information, or rather disinformation campaigns, to keep justifying what is going on inside Ukraine. It's incredibly difficult to counter that, but what you absolutely can do is stick the spanner in by calling things out very simply and consistently into the future, and we must keep our own energies high to continue to do that. Thanks.
Thank you for doing that, Nataliya.
I'll go on with the story. As I understand here also, there are a lot of Ukrainians who left, and this is also the question, the difficult question. So just recently, I've spoken to my sister, and she told a story about her colleague that just before the New Year in Kiev, she was bringing up her son as a single mother. The guy is 10 years, and there was a air alert and night explosion somewhere far away. But it happened that this lady, unfortunately, fainted, and the boy just became afraid that the mother had died. So he started to knock to the doors of the neighbors. Was so scared that he couldn't go on studying. So actually, she left. She left the job. She couldn't work any longer, and she left the country something like 2 weeks ago. Despite nothing happened to house, but we see also the other ways how this war impacts something. At the same time, I should say that my sister is a civil servant. She works for the city administration, and additional job to her everyday job is also be a secretary in the commission, which register the shelling in the houses and do all this commission investigation how people should be paid. So she sometimes after said like, I probably would leave the job because I can't any longer, because they start working at 7 a.m. they finish at 11 p.m. they work on Saturdays because that's the only way to do that. And she said like probably maybe at least does something good, but she lost a colleague. So, it's not an easy situation, and I'm definitely not like an optimistic, but, we all remain hopeful, and that is the difference. That maybe Ukrainians today, if you speak about the morale, they're not so optimistic, but they are hopeful, and the difference is you pursue, you go on what you do. And of course, there was this moment of unity, and if you look at Ukraine now, you see like, oh, maybe it's not there. I think we are there coming from emotional unity to pragmatic unity, and it's also something to bring this pragmatism here. Because what I'm feeling that often where Ukraine is now is taken for granted, and it's sometimes forgotten that as if it's in the book that it takes us all the running to be where we are. And that should be probably appreciated. And therefore I really call everybody not to be swayed by the emotions, because I feel them anywhere outside of Ukraine, even more than inside sometimes. As I said, we do remain extremely pragmatic, and all the calls for weapons, for support, for something are actually very, very, very clear, because they do have a particular result. So that would be, my take.
Unity, yes, thank you. Rory, you have the final word.
Oh boy. Okay. Olesya, earlier you mentioned our presentations in 2014. I remember very clearly one at the House of Lords where we were told that, for those of us who are raising this flag of an escalation from the Russian side, that we were being hysterical, that this wasn't going to happen, emotional, right? That the Kremlin wouldn't be so reckless. We've heard this time and time again. And what worries me greatly is that we're kind of sliding back into this new normal now. So what I encountered in 2014, a lot of attention about Ukraine, a lot of action that was promised by politicians and diplomats, and then slowly but surely attention waned. And the question earlier was, why haven't we been able to put forward a sanctions regime that really bites into Russia's economy? And part of the reason is that they've been planning for this. They've been planning for this for 10 years, and we haven't. So we're constantly reactive. And this problem of a cost-benefit analysis of, let's say, if we can maybe escalate a little bit here, the Russians will finally see reason it's not going to happen. We've seen this time and time again. So I suppose what I would say to finish up is that we need a complete change of posture. We need a completely different type of mentality. We need to go on a mental war footing, which doesn't mean we need to be aggressive. And I'm really pleased that our leadership here in this country, less so in the United States, is speaking clearly about what's taking place. But the threats here are grave, they're very, very urgent, and we're sliding back into this position of not wanting to deal with it. It's too horrible, it's too difficult. But I do think we need to be more creative. We need to get on the front foot with the Russian Federation. We need to completely articulate to our political representatives how important this is to us. And we need to encourage them to speak up about how this war is our war, and therefore when we have displaced Ukrainians here in this country, we need to keep them here and support them for as long as that takes. So with that, I would just say let's change our mentality and let's stop perpetuating this pattern of cost benefits with respect to Russia. We need a completely different posture.
Fantastic, thank you so much. Please join me in thanking Christina, Nataliya Gumenyuk, Rory, Finnin, and Pedro Serrano, the European Parliament Liaison Office in the UK and European Delegation to the UK. And thank you all of you for showing up here tonight and asking your questions. Please stay for the reception. Thank you.